The afternoon sun beat down on the throng gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists from every corner of the globe jostled for position. Cameras held aloft, all vying for the perfect shot of the iconic landmark and, of course, its stoic sentinels. The air buzzed with a mix of languages, the click of camera shutters, and the excited chatter of vacationers soaking in the atmosphere of London. The royal guards, clad in their scarlet tunics and bearskin hats, stood motionless on their posts, seemingly impervious to the heat and the constant attention. They were living symbols of British tradition, their unwavering composure a testament to centuries of discipline and duty. They were as much a part of the London experience as Big Ben or a ride on a red double-decker bus. Their presence was a silent, powerful statement, a reminder of the history and heritage that permeated every brick and cobblestone of the city. Today, however, the stage was set for a disruption of this carefully orchestrated scene. A rogue element was about to be introduced, an unpredictable variable that threatened to shatter the illusion of perfect order. This element came in the form of a tourist, fueled by alcohol and a misguided sense of bravado, who was about to learn a very harsh lesson about respecting boundaries and underestimating the resolve of a royal guard. The incident was a collision of cultures, a clash between carefree vacationing and unwavering duty, and it was all about to unfold in the heart of London under the watchful gaze of the Queen's residence. The consequences, as the saying goes, would never be the same again. Amidst the sea of faces, one stood out, not for his admiration of the palace or his respect for tradition, but for his boisterous behavior and increasingly erratic movements. This was our protagonist, or perhaps more accurately, our antagonist. Let's call him Kevin, a name as unremarkable as his initial intentions. Kevin hailed from Ohio, a land known more for its cornfields than its confrontations with symbols of monarchy. He was in London for a bachelor party. A last hurrah before his friend, Dave, tied the knot. The group had been hitting the pubs hard since landing, fueled by cheap beer and the heady excitement of being in a foreign land. Kevin, in particular, had embraced the when in Rome philosophy with perhaps too much enthusiasm. But he was loud, he was jovial, and he was undeniably drunk. His tie was askew, his shirt was untucked, and his speech was slurred. He was the kind of tourist that locals often rolled their eyes at, the embodiment of the ugly American stereotype. He'd started the day taking harmless selfies with statues and attempting, badly, to imitate a British accent. But as the alcohol took hold, his behavior had become increasingly obnoxious. He tried to get a pigeon to drink beer. He'd loudly critiqued the Queen's fashion sense, and he'd generally made a nuisance of himself. His friends, Dave and Mark, had tried to rein him in, but their efforts were largely futile. "Come on, Kev, tone it down a bit," Dave had pleaded, but Kevin had just laughed and clapped him on the back, nearly sending him sprawling. Mark had tried a more subtle approach, attempting to distract him with a tour guide spiel about the history of the palace, but Kevin's attention span was shorter than a TikTok video. Now, fueled by a potent combination of lager and misplaced confidence, Kevin's gaze had locked onto the stoic figure of the royal guard. That he saw not a symbol of tradition and authority, but a challenge, a target for his drunken antics. The stage was set for the inevitable clash, and Kevin, oblivious to the consequences, was about to stumble headfirst into a world of trouble. The royal guard, standing ramrod straight, seemed utterly unaware of Kevin's growing agitation. He was a picture of unwavering discipline, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his face an impassive mask. But Kevin's drunken mind interpreted this stoicism as indifference, an invitation to push the boundaries. He started by inching closer, weaving slightly as he moved, his steps betraying his inebriated state. He muttered jokes under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear, but just below the threshold that might provoke a reaction from the guard. "Hey, buddy," he slurred, his voice thick with alcohol. "Nice hat. You sweat much in that thing?" No response. Kevin grinned, emboldened by the lack of reaction. He took another step closer. Now standing just a few feet away from the guard, Dave and Mark, realizing the situation was rapidly escalating, tried to intervene. "Kev, leave it, mate, it's not worth it," Dave said, grabbing Kevin's arm. Kevin shrugged him off, his eyes locked on the guard. "Nah, I just want to see if he's real," he mumbled, his words slurring together. He began to circle the guard slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. He made exaggerated gestures, mimicking the guard's stiff posture and marching gait, drawing snickers from some of the onlookers, but the guard remained unmoved, a statue carved from stone. Kevin's taunts grew bolder. His voice louder, he started making jokes about the Queen, crude and insensitive remarks that drew gasps from some of the nearby tourists. Still, the guard didn't flinch. Frustrated by the lack of response, Kevin decided to escalate things further. He reached out, intending to poke the guard in the chest, just a playful jab, or so he would later claim. But his coordination was off, his aim was poor, and his judgment was severely impaired. Instead of a gentle poke, his hand connected with the guard's chest with a surprising amount of force, a clumsy shove that rocked the stoic figure slightly. The crowd gasped. The air crackled with tension. The game was over. Kevin had crossed the line. Kevin's actions leading up to the shove weren't born of malice, but rather a potent cocktail of alcohol, ignorance, and a desperate need for attention. Each ignored warning, each step closer to the guard, was a deliberate act of rebellion against the unspoken rules of decorum and respect. He wasn't trying to start a fight. He was trying to get a reaction, any reaction, from the seemingly unreactive figure. He saw the guard as a prop, an inanimate object to be poked and prodded for his own amusement. The verbal taunts were a test, a probe to see where the line was drawn. When the guard remained silent, Kevin interpreted it as permission to go further. The crude jokes about the Queen were a step too far, crossing the line from harmless banter into outright disrespect. Even then, the guard remained impassive, his face a mask of unwavering composure. This only served to embolden Kevin, fueling his drunken desire to break through the facade and elicit some kind of response. His friends, Dave and Mark, were increasingly exasperated. They had tried everything to stop him, reason, persuasion, even physical intervention. But Kevin was like a runaway train, barreling towards disaster with reckless abandon. They knew that he wasn't a bad guy, just a stupid one, and they desperately wanted to prevent him from doing something that he would regret. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. Kevin was too far gone, lost in his own drunken world, oblivious to the consequences of his actions. Other tourists, initially amused by Kevin's antics, began to shift uneasily. The atmosphere had changed, the light-hearted banter replaced by a palpable sense of tension. Some started to move away, sensing that something bad was about to happen. Others pulled out their phones, ready to record the inevitable confrontation. The air was thick with anticipation, a collective holding of breath as Kevin took the final, fateful step that would change everything. The culmination of Kevin's misguided actions arrived with the force of a poorly aimed punch. The shove, as Kevin would later desperately try to reframe it, was more of a drunken lunge, a flailing attempt to make contact with the seemingly impenetrable royal guard. His intention, as clouded as it was by alcohol, wasn't to inflict harm, but to provoke a response, to shatter the guard's stoic facade and reveal the human being beneath. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the guard's duty, mistaking their silence for weakness, their discipline for passivity. The verbal taunts had been escalating for several minutes. A barrage of drunken insults and crude jokes aimed at testing the guard's limits. He'd mocked the uniform, the hat, even the Queen herself, each jibe delivered with a growing sense of entitlement and a complete lack of respect. When words failed to elicit a reaction, Kevin resorted to physical contact, first with the near poke to the chest, then with the shove that finally triggered the guard's response. Before the shove, there had been smaller, almost imperceptible, violations of personal space. Kevin had invaded the guard's immediate vicinity, stepping closer than any reasonable person would, crowding him and making him feel increasingly uncomfortable. He'd even reached out and touched the guard's uniform, a brief, fleeting contact that was nonetheless a clear violation of boundaries. Each of these actions, though seemingly minor in isolation, contributed to the overall sense of disrespect and provocation that culminated in the shove. Kevin's misinterpretation of the guard's silence was perhaps the most crucial element in the escalation. He assumed that because the guard didn't react, he wouldn't react, that he was somehow immune to provocation. He failed to understand that the guard's silence was not a sign of weakness, but a testament to their training and discipline, a conscious decision to remain composed in the face of adversity. In Kevin's drunken mind, however, the lack of response was an invitation to push harder, to test the limits of the guard's tolerance. He was tragically wrong. The shove, or the punch as the headlines would later scream, wasn't a knockout blow. It wasn't a carefully calculated strike delivered with precision and force. It was In reality, a clumsy, off-balance push, fueled more by alcohol than genuine aggression. Kevin's feet were unsteady. His arm was limp, and his aim was, to put it mildly, atrocious. The impact itself was more of a glancing blow, a clumsy thud against the guard's chest that barely registered on his stoic face. For a split second, the guard remained motionless. An unyielding pillar of red and black. It was a crucial moment, a test of his training and discipline that he could have lashed out in anger, retaliated with a swift and brutal strike. But he didn't. He remained composed, assessing the situation with a cool, detached gaze. Then, with a speed that belied his seemingly rigid posture, he reacted. It wasn't a punch in return. It was far more efficient, far more decisive. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, using Kevin's own momentum against him. He grasped Kevin's arm, twisted it sharply behind his back, and executed a swift takedown, sending the drunken tourist sprawling onto the pavement. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. One moment, Kevin was standing, emboldened by his drunken antics. The next, he was face down on the cold stone, his arm twisted painfully behind him, the weight of the guard pressing down on his back. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath as the reality of the situation sunk in. The laughter and jeers that had punctuated Kevin's earlier antics were replaced by stunned silence. The transformation was complete. The prop had become a force, the object of ridicule, a figure of authority. The guard, now in control of the situation, held Kevin firmly in place, his face still impassive. His duty fulfilled. The world seemed to tilt on its axis for Kevin. One moment he was upright, fueled by beer and bravado. The next he was face down, tasting the gritty reality of the London pavement. The shock of the takedown momentarily sobered him, replacing his drunken arrogance with a surge of confusion and regret. "What the?" he mumbled, his words muffled by the unforgiving stone. The pain in his arm was sharp and immediate, a stark reminder that his actions had consequences. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of shock, amusement, and nervous apprehension. Some gasped, others chuckled nervously, unsure of how to react to the sudden turn of events. A few began to applaud, a spontaneous expression of support for the guard and a condemnation of Kevin's disruptive behavior. The clicking of camera shutters intensified as everyone scrambled to capture the moment for posterity. The incident was quickly going viral, transforming from a local disturbance into an international spectacle. Dave and Mark rushed forward, their faces etched with concern and embarrassment. "Let him up. He didn't mean anything by it," Dave pleaded, his voice laced with desperation. Mark, more pragmatic, tried to assess the situation, looking around for someone in authority who could de-escalate the situation. But it was too late. The wheels were already in motion, and the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Kevin, still pinned to the ground, began to panic. The initial confusion had given way to a dawning realization of the seriousness of his predicament. He was in a foreign country, under arrest, for assaulting a symbol of British authority. The consequences, he knew, could be severe. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking with fear. But his apologies were lost in the noise and confusion, drowned out by the clicking of cameras and the murmurs of the crowd. He was trapped, both physically and metaphorically, a prisoner of his own drunken stupidity. The distant wail of sirens sliced through the air, growing louder with each passing second. The sound, initially faint and almost imperceptible, quickly escalated into a piercing crescendo, signaling the imminent arrival of reinforcements. The cavalry was on its way. The situation, already tense and fraught with uncertainty, was about to become even more complex. First on the scene were 2 uniformed police officers, their faces grim and businesslike. They pushed their way through the throng of onlookers, their eyes scanning the scene, assessing the situation with practiced efficiency. They spoke briefly with the Royal Guard, their voices low and serious, exchanging information and establishing the facts. Then, they turned their attention to Kevin, still pinned to the ground, his face a mask of fear and regret. Close behind the police officers came 2 more Royal Guards, their expressions as impassive and unreadable as their comrade who had executed the takedown. They formed a protective perimeter around the scene, their presence a stark reminder of the seriousness of the situation. Their arrival added an extra layer of formality and authority, reinforcing the message that Kevin's actions would not be tolerated. As the sirens wailed even louder, a police van screeched to a halt nearby, disgorging several more officers. Their faces grim and determined, the area around Buckingham Palace was quickly transforming into a scene of controlled chaos. A whirlwind of flashing lights, shouted instructions, and anxious faces. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple drunken altercation. It had become a matter of national security, a challenge to the authority of the crown. The weight of that reality was beginning to dawn on Kevin, as he lay face down on the pavement, surrounded by the forces of law and order. His ill-conceived prank had backfired spectacularly, transforming his vacation into a nightmare. The police officers, after a brief consultation, moved swiftly to secure Kevin. He was rolled onto his back, his protests echoing weakly amidst the surrounding chaos. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, a stark and undeniable symbol of his loss of freedom. "Hey, what are you doing?" "I didn't do anything," he protested, his voice laced with a mixture of fear and indignation. His protests, however, were met with stony silence. The officers were professional and efficient, their movements precise and deliberate. They read him his rights, their words clipped and formal, a stark contrast to Kevin's slurred and desperate pleas. The language barrier, if it existed at all, was quickly overcome by the universal language of authority. Kevin's attempts to explain himself, to justify his actions, were met with polite but firm resistance. "I didn't mean to. It was just a joke. I was drunk," he stammered, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. But his arguments were futile. The officers had seen it all before. They were unmoved by his pleas, unimpressed by his excuses. They had a job to do, and they were going to do it. Regardless of Kevin's protests, he was lifted to his feet, his arms secured behind his back, and led towards the waiting police van. The walk to the van was a gauntlet of flashing lights and curious stares, a public shaming that amplified his sense of humiliation and despair as he was bundled into the back of the van. Kevin made one last desperate appeal to his friends. "Dave, Mark, help me," he cried, his voice cracking with emotion. Dave and Mark, their faces etched with concern, tried to approach the van, but they were quickly waved away by the police officers. They could only watch helplessly as their friend was driven away, his fate hanging precariously in the balance. The doors of the van slammed shut, sealing Kevin's fate and marking the beginning of a long and arduous journey through the British legal system. The sterile environment of the interrogation room did little to calm Kevin's frayed nerves. The harsh fluorescent lighting, the cold metal table, and the two stern-faced detectives across from him only amplified his sense of dread. The initial shock of the arrest had worn off, replaced by a gnawing anxiety and a growing awareness of the gravity of his situation. He was no longer just a drunk tourist who had made a stupid mistake. He was a suspect in a serious crime, facing potentially severe consequences. The interrogation began with the standard formalities: name, date of birth, nationality, purpose of visit. Kevin answered the questions mechanically. His voice barely a whisper, he stumbled over his words, struggling to articulate his story in a coherent and believable manner. The detectives listened patiently, their expressions inscrutable, their eyes unwavering. They asked him to recount the events leading up to the incident, probing for inconsistencies and contradictions in his narrative. Kevin, desperate to minimize his culpability, tried to portray his actions as a harmless prank, a drunken misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion. He claimed that he hadn't intended to harm the guard, that he had simply wanted to have some fun. He downplayed his verbal taunts, characterizing them as lighthearted banter, and insisted that the shove had been accidental, a clumsy stumble caused by his inebriated state. The detectives, however, were not buying it. They presented him with video evidence of the incident, footage captured by the ubiquitous smartphones of the tourists who had witnessed the event. The video clearly showed Kevin's escalating behavior, his deliberate provocations, and the undeniable force of his shove. Confronted with the undeniable truth, Kevin's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. He broke down, tears streaming down his face, as the full weight of his actions finally crashed down upon him. He was no longer just facing a minor charge of public intoxication. He was facing potential jail time, a criminal record, and the lasting shame of his actions. The list of charges read out by the duty solicitor felt like a hammer blow to Kevin's already fragile state. Assault, disturbing the peace, and public intoxication were just the beginning. The assault charge, in particular, carried significant weight, given that the victim was a royal guard, a symbol of the crown and British authority. The potential penalties ranged from hefty fines to a custodial sentence, depending on the severity of the assault and the judge's discretion. The solicitor explained the intricacies of the British legal system, a labyrinth of rules and procedures that were completely foreign to Kevin. He learned that he could face jail time, even for a relatively minor assault, if the judge deemed his actions to be sufficiently disrespectful or threatening. He also learned that a criminal record in the UK could have serious implications for his future travel and employment prospects. The situation was further complicated by the fact that the incident had attracted significant media attention. The video of Kevin's drunken antics had gone viral, sparking outrage and condemnation both in the UK and in the US. The public pressure to punish Kevin was immense, and the judge would be acutely aware of the potential for criticism if he were to hand down a lenient sentence. The solicitor advised Kevin to contact the American embassy, as they could provide him with legal assistance and consular support. The embassy's involvement, however, was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they could help him navigate the legal system and ensure that his rights were protected. On the other hand, their involvement could also draw even more attention to the case, further intensifying the media frenzy and increasing the pressure on the judge. Kevin's future hung precariously in the balance, his fate resting on the decisions of lawyers, judges, and politicians. His drunken prank had spiraled out of control, transforming his vacation into a legal and public relations disaster. He was facing the very real prospect of spending time in a British jail, thousands of miles from home, a stark and sobering reminder of the consequences of his actions. The internet exploded. Within hours, the video of Kevin's drunken escapade had been shared millions of times across every social media platform imaginable. Hashtag Royal Guard Rumble, hashtag Drunk Tourist Down, and hashtag Buckingham Brawl were trending worldwide, fueling a global conversation about respect, tradition, and the behavior of tourists abroad. News outlets on both sides of the Atlantic picked up the story, running sensationalized headlines and dramatic footage of the incident. The initial reports were vague, referring to the perpetrator as simply an American tourist, but it didn't take long for the internet sleuths to uncover Kevin's identity. Within hours, his name, age, hometown, and even his Facebook profile were circulating online. Pictures of him posing with his friends, drinking beer, and generally enjoying his vacation were juxtaposed with the damning video of his confrontation with the Royal Guard, creating a stark and unflattering contrast. The comments sections of news articles and social media posts were filled with vitriol and condemnation. Some called for Kevin to be thrown in jail, while others demanded that he be banned from the UK for life. Many used the incident as an opportunity to confined to a small, sparsely furnished jail cell. Kevin wrestled with a maelstrom of emotions. The shame was overwhelming, a burning sensation that consumed him from the inside out. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, cringing at his own stupidity and recklessness. How could he have been so foolish? How could he have allowed himself to get so drunk and act so disrespectfully? The regret was equally intense, a gnawing sense of what could have been. He had ruined his friend's bachelor party, embarrassed himself and his country, and jeopardized his future. The fear was perhaps the most potent emotion of all. He was terrified of what lay ahead, the legal proceedings, the potential jail time, the lasting impact on his reputation. He imagined his parents' disappointment, his friends' judgment, and the scorn of strangers who knew him only as the drunk American tourist who had punched a royal guard. He worried about his job, his relationships, and his ability to move on from this catastrophic mistake. In the depths of his despair, Kevin began to contemplate ways to make amends. He knew that a simple apology wouldn't be enough to undo the damage he had caused. But he felt compelled to do something, anything, to show that he was genuinely sorry for his actions. He drafted a letter of apology to the Royal Guard, expressing his remorse and acknowledging the disrespect he had shown. He also considered making a public statement, taking responsibility for his actions and vowing to learn from his mistakes. He knew that his attempts to apologize and make amends might be met with skepticism and cynicism. But he felt that it was his moral obligation to try it. He had made a terrible mistake, and he had to face the consequences. But he also had to try to salvage something from the wreckage, to demonstrate that he was not simply a drunken lout, but a human being capable of remorse and redemption. While Kevin grappled with the fallout from his actions, the Royal Guard, whom we'll call Private Davies, had already returned to his post. After providing a brief statement to the police, he simply resumed his duties, standing ramrod straight, his face an impassive mask, seemingly unaffected by the events that had just transpired. The incident, for him, was a minor inconvenience, a brief interruption in the routine of his day. He had been trained to handle all sorts of situations, from unruly tourists to potential security threats. Kevin's drunken antics, while certainly annoying and disrespectful, were hardly the most challenging situation he had faced in his years of service. The takedown had been swift and efficient, a textbook maneuver that he had practiced countless times during his training. He had acted in accordance with his orders, protecting himself and upholding the dignity of the crown. For Private Davies, maintaining composure was paramount. He understood that he was not just a soldier. He was a symbol of British tradition and authority. His behavior, both on and off duty, reflected on the entire institution. He couldn't afford to let his emotions get the better of him. To react impulsively or aggressively, he had to remain calm, disciplined, and professional, regardless of the provocation. Later that evening, after his shift had ended, Private Davies might have mentioned the incident to his colleagues, perhaps with a wry smile and a shake of his head. They would have shared similar stories, recounting their own encounters with drunken tourists and other disruptive individuals. They would have reaffirmed the importance of maintaining composure and upholding the standards of the Royal Guard, no matter the circumstances, and then they would have moved on, returning to their lives and their duties, leaving Kevin to face the consequences of his actions. Kevin's life would never be quite the same. The immediate consequences were obvious: a ruined vacation, a night spent in a cold, uncomfortable jail cell, and the looming threat of legal action. But the long-term impact of his drunken escapade would extend far beyond the confines of that London jail. The legal battles would drag on for months, consuming his time, his energy, and his financial resources. He would have to hire a lawyer, navigate the complexities of the British legal system, and face the daunting prospect of a trial. Even if he managed to avoid jail time, he would likely be saddled with hefty fines and a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. The reputation damage would be even more difficult to overcome. The video of his drunken antics would continue to circulate online, popping up in search results and social media feeds for years to come. He would be forever known as the drunk American tourist who had punched a Royal Guard, a label that would haunt him in his personal and professional life. His relationships would also suffer. His friends, while initially supportive, would grow tired of hearing about his legal troubles and his constant self-pity. His family would be disappointed and embarrassed by his actions, struggling to reconcile the image of their son with the unflattering portrayal in the media. Even his relationship with Dave, whose bachelor party he had ruined, would be strained, a constant reminder of the events that had transpired in London. But perhaps the most significant consequence of all would be the internal one. Kevin would have to live with the knowledge that he had made a terrible mistake. A mistake that had caused harm to others and brought shame upon himself. He would have to confront his own demons, to examine his behavior, and to commit to making changes in his life. The road to redemption would be long and arduous, but it was a journey that he had to undertake if he wanted to move on from this catastrophic chapter in his life. After months of legal wrangling and intense negotiations, Kevin's case finally reached a resolution. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy and potentially damaging trial, his lawyer negotiated a plea bargain with the prosecution. Kevin agreed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of disorderly conduct in exchange for avoiding a more serious assault conviction. The judge, taking into account Kevin's remorse, his willingness to apologize, and the fact that the Royal Guard had not suffered any serious injuries, handed down a relatively lenient sentence. Kevin was ordered to pay a substantial fine, perform community service, and write a formal letter of apology to the Royal Guard. He was also issued a deportation order, banning him from re-entering the UK for a period of 5 years. As he boarded the plane back to the United States, Kevin reflected on the events that had transpired in London. He had come to the UK seeking fun and adventure, but he had left with a criminal record, a tarnished reputation, and a profound sense of shame, he had learned a harsh lesson about the consequences of his actions, the importance of respecting cultural symbols, and the dangers of alcohol abuse. He vowed to make amends for his mistakes, to live a more responsible and respectful life. He would complete his community service, write his letter of apology, and seek help for his alcohol problem. He would also use his experience as a cautionary tale, warning others about the dangers of drunken behavior and the importance of respecting foreign cultures. The incident in London would forever be a part of Kevin's story, a dark chapter in his life that he could never fully erase. But he hoped that he could learn from his mistakes, to grow as a person, and to ultimately redeem himself in the eyes of his family, his friends, and the world. The journey would be long and difficult, but he was determined to make the most of it, to transform his shame into something positive, and to prove that he was more than just the drunk American tourist who had punched a royal guard. The story of Kevin, the drunk American tourist who punched a royal guard, serves as a potent reminder of several important lessons. Firstly, it underscores the critical importance of respecting cultural symbols and laws when traveling abroad. What might be considered a harmless prank in one culture can be a serious offense in another. Understanding and respecting local customs is essential for responsible and enjoyable travel. Secondly, the incident highlights the dangers of intoxication and the impaired judgment that often accompanies it. Alcohol can lower inhibitions, cloud reasoning, and lead to reckless behavior, with potentially devastating consequences. Moderation and responsible drinking are crucial, especially in unfamiliar environments. Perhaps the most poignant observation is the stark contrast between Kevin's impulsive actions and the unwavering composure of the royal guard. While Kevin succumbed to his drunken impulses, Private Davies remained calm, disciplined, and professional, even in the face of provocation. His actions exemplified the importance of self-control, integrity, and unwavering dedication to duty. In the end, the story of Kevin and the Royal Guard is not just a cautionary tale about a drunken tourist's misadventure. It is a reflection on the clash of cultures, the consequences of irresponsible behavior, and the enduring power of respect, tradition, and self-discipline. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's a reminder that sometimes the best way to make a lasting impression is not with a punch, but with a respectful nod.